From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome. I'm Nicole Saylor. I'm head of the archive at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest presentation of the ongoing Benjamin A. Botkin Lecture Series. The Botkin Series allows us to highlight the work of leading scholars in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural heritage, while enhancing the collections here at the American Folklife Center. For the center and the library, the Botkin Lecture formed a facet of our acquisitions activities. Each lecture is videotaped and it becomes part of the permanent collection of the center. In addition, lectures are later posted as webcasts on the library's website, where they're available for viewing worldwide. And so this would be a good time to remind you that you'll want to silence your cell phones and whatever other electronic devices that you have with you. So today I have the honor of introducing the distinguished folklorist and longtime friend of the American Folklife Center, James P. Leary of the University of Wisconsin. Professor Leary was born and raised in Rice Lake, a farming and logging town in northern Wisconsin. He earned his BA in literature from the University of Notre Dame before going on for an MA in folklore at the University of North Carolina and a PhD in folklore and American studies from Indiana University. Currently, he is the Birgit Baldwin Professor of Scandinavian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has done research and production for numerous festivals, museum exhibits, radio programs, documentary sound recordings, and films documenting folk life in the upper Midwest. His publications, which have the best titles ever, include Minnesota Polka, Yodeling in Dairyland, The History of Swiss Dairyland, The History of Swiss Music in Wisconsin, Down Home Dairyland, So Oli Says to Lena, Folk Humor in the Upper Midwest, and my personal favorite, Polkabilly, How the Goose Island Ramblers Refined American Folk Music. And when he's not doing that in his spare time, he's the co-editor of the Journal of American Folklore, and he's the co-founder and current director of the UW's Center for the Study of Upper Midwestern Cultures. Among his other projects, he's currently working with the center on a series of productions related to the 75th anniversary of Alan Lomax's trip through Michigan. His presentation today is titled Folksongs of Another America, Field Recordings of the Upper Midwest, 1937 to 46, and he draws on materials here at the archives, and he looks into research into the roots of this music and its branches in and around the Great Lakes region. Jim is a tireless evangelist to win recognition for music in the upper Midwest, and as someone who's been a small part of that journey, I'm especially thrilled to have him here. So please make him feel welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Nikki. Nikki was at the University of Wisconsin and did some great stuff there, and it's thrilling to have her out here. And I'm delighted to be here, delighted to see so many friends. And as Nikki mentioned, this project that I'm working on, I have been working on it pretty intensively for about 7 or 8 years, and intermittently going back almost 30 years. Has to do with collections here at the Library of Congress. Between 1937 and 1946, there were almost 2,000 songs and tunes recorded in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota for the Library of Congress by 3 different field researchers, and some of those materials have been reissued, or issued rather, on LPs and so forth, but most of them have not. And the main reason why most of them have not is that most of them are in languages other than English. Back in the 70s, when the American Folklife Center convened a conference on ethnic recordings in America, Joe Hickerson, who was then the archivist, wrote that in the 1930s, the United States government and the library were disinclined to make much of the so-called foreign language recordings because of an ideological stance toward monolingualism in the United States, kind of a melting pot philosophy. And so that's one reason why most of these recordings have been hidden or forgotten. But another reason is just the challenge of dealing with those languages. Because they include 25 languages, not counting dialects thereof, and many of the songs are also in kind of mixed language, mixing English with the various languages, or sometimes they use esoteric occupational terminology from logging or mining or farming, or little idioms from various locales. My own involvement in this goes back many years, but first I kind of want to just situate things, and this is actually a map not so much for this project, I've still got to get one made, but this comes from my book Polkabilly, and the places shown there by name are places where I've either done fieldwork or archival work, but I'll just come up and I hope you can hear me. The recordings actually were done by Alan Lomax in Michigan, in the Detroit area, in central Michigan, kind of up around Traverse City and off in Beaver Island, and also in a Polish settlement, Madison and Posen. And then he went into the UP in 1938. He imagined in 3 months doing fieldwork through this entire area on a rapid recording survey, but when he got to the UP, he really got hung up with all of the French Canadians and Finns and other people there, and had such a good time. He made it into Odena, Wisconsin, to the Bad River Ojibwa Reservation for one recording session, but that was it. So we'll look at this area. The first recordings in '37 were done by Sidney Robertson, actually in Cloquet, Minnesota, and up on the Iron Range in Minnesota, but also in Rhinelander and Crandon areas of northern Wisconsin with lumberjacks here, actually in Duluth with a Scots Gaelic singer, with Serbs in Eveleth, and with Finns in Cloquet and Virginia, and up over here in Ely. And then in the 40s, Helene Stratman Thomas did work. And we're going to start kind of here in Rice Lake, which is my hometown. As Nikki said, it was a farming and logging town, and I was born there in 1950. When I was a kid, I used to love to go into Rindlisbacher's Tavern, because Otto Rindlisbacher, who was born in 1895, had behind the bar the world's largest collection of odd lumber camp musical instruments, as he called it. And this was a great museum bar that also had a lot of taxidermy. Otto was a skilled taxidermist, and among the real animals he had such things as the fur herring, the owl-eyed ripple skipper, the dingbat, the snow snake, and also old Satchelass, the world's largest muskie, which weighed 50 pounds more than the real world's largest muskie at Louis Spray's bar just down the street. But all these instruments were there, including some that Otto made, Hardanger fiddle, a Norwegian fiddle. He was the child of Swiss immigrants. He was a great performer on the Schweitzer Handorgel, a little button accordion. But he also worked in the woods and sawmills. He learned how to play a lot of different kinds of jigs and reels from French and French Indian and Irish background. There were a lot of Norwegians in the area, and he learned how to play a lot of Norwegian music as well. And in 1937, for the National Folk Festival, which happened that year in Chicago, he organized a troupe called the Wisconsin Lumberjacks, and then in 1938 they came out here and performed in Washington, D.C. And I got to know him some, and I also got to know the fellow on the lower right with the pipe, Ray Calkins, who I interviewed when he was in his 90s. He was still going pretty strong there for a few years. In 1926, during the Henry Ford fiddle contest period, Otto organized an old-time fiddlers contest. It was Prohibition, so his tavern was then a billiard parlor and ice cream parlor. But these are a bunch of fiddlers, including the bottom right, a guy named Ernest Pea Soup Guibord, who was a French Ojibwe from Coudray, who later on I got to meet at the Honor of the Earth powwow up there. I started doing fieldwork myself with musicians in particular in the late 1970s. And I've done work in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, northern Lower Michigan, throughout Wisconsin, and quite a bit in Minnesota as well. And these are a few images of some of my work. And a few years ago, I did a book called Polkabilly, where I tried to look at the fusion of Anglo-American kind of hillbilly music with non-Anglo-European social dance music and dialect songs, or polka music. And the key group for that was a group called the Goose Island Ramblers. But we want to turn to these historic recordings, and some of you, of course, may be familiar with Sidney Robertson on your right. Educated at Berkeley, and eventually the wife of the avant-garde American composer Henry Cowell, very interested in classical music, but also had that kind of populist avant-garde interest in folk music in the 1930s. Was teaching in New York City. The New School for Social Research in the 30s, and then was hired by Charles Seeger during the Roosevelt's administration's in the resettlement agency. And part of Charles Seeger's notion was that for people who were displaced and suffering from the Depression, that performing traditional music would raise their spirits. Sidney was located in Minnesota for a while, and because of her interest in folk music, began to do field recordings kind of around the region, and as a result discovered a number of contacts and began to make field recordings in 1937. She was so excited. Thereafter, she went actually to California, and there's a superb website on the American Folklife Center's site, the Library of Congress, called California Gold, looking at her extraordinary recordings in Northern California. And recently there's been some great scholarship done on her work on the Aran Islands, where she was one of the early people to make really good sound recordings there. But she was very excited by Wisconsin and Minnesota, wrote to Alan Lomax at the time, who was the assistant in charge at the Archive of American Folksong. And he was interested, of course, in occupational songs, lumberjack and Great Lakes songs for some of these compendia that he and his father had been doing on American Folksong. But he also had a strong awareness of the kind of ethnic and cultural and linguistic diversity in the region. And so he came out in 1938, late summer and early fall, and did field work. And these people, I think, are relatively well known, especially Alan Lomax, but less well known is a woman named Helene Stratman Thomas, who was born in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, part German and part Cornish. And when Alan Lomax wasn't able to complete his 3-month survey of 3 states, he wrote to the University of Wisconsin Music Department seeing if someone would take up the challenge of trying to record traditional music in the area. And Stratman Thomas was willing to do this. And in the summer of 1940, summer of 1941, and the summer of 1946, after the war, she made different field trips. She recorded over 700 songs and tunes. I want to focus mostly today on some of her fieldwork, although we'll get to Alan Lomax's toward the end. And there's such a huge range of material here, but what I really want to look at are songs that have to do with what we might call cultural ferment, cultural creativity, creolization. I want to look at songs that have to do with people singing about the experience of being in America in languages other than English, or also at mixed language songs, including mixed language songs involving indigenous people. And I'll be projecting lyrics, bilingual, of those in just a moment. But this is Helene Stratman Thomas with Harry Dyer on the left, who was a Mississippi River riverboat man. in the center, she's there with a couple of Holland Dutch singers, and on the right with a Swedish singer. Here she is in my hometown with Iva and Lois Rindlisbacher playing Swiss bells. And on the left here is John Czeszak, who was a Gorali or Polish Highlander fiddler in Stevens Point. And on the right, in her bunad, is Britta Lotte, who was a Norwegian immigrant, also very adept at handwork, but knew a lot of old songs. We don't know who this fellow is, one of the lumberjacks. Actually, at Alan Lomax's request, Stratman Thomas was on the lookout for vulgar lumberjack songs, but since they wouldn't sing them in front of her, she had some UW students working for her as audio engineer, and so a guy named Bob Draves, while Helene waited out in the car, recorded songs singing about E is the end of a long stick and F is a who off his prick, and exciting lyrics like that. And then seated in the chair here is Donaldo Lagrandeur from Somerset, Wisconsin, whose parents were French Canadians who moved down into that community. Here are some Czechs or Bohemians from Yuba, Wisconsin, a little north of the southern Wisconsin River. And at the extreme right is Aunt Lily Richmond, who was born in slavery in Missouri. Her family escaped early in the Civil War, and they came up to southwestern Wisconsin, part of a small African-American farming community in Grant County. Bessie Gordon sawed off the legs of a pump organ so it would fit behind her mom and pop tavern in Schofield, Wisconsin. They ran a dairy farm, and she would sing songs and sometimes yodel. We're not quite sure who this fellow is playing the hand drum, but there were a number of native peoples gathered in Wisconsin dells. Wisconsin has 11 American Indian nations with their own, tribal area. Among them are the Ho-Chunk. The Ho-Chunk were removed, formerly known as Winnebago. They were pushed out in the mid-19th century to reservations first in Minnesota, and then when the Sioux Uprising came along, Minnesota didn't want any native people there, so they got shoved to South Dakota, and they grew up on rivers and woods, and there they were in kind of desert country, and they were miserable and starving, and so they got some land from the Omaha and the Missouri River, but a lot of them never left. They hid out, and then also they have a very strong warrior tradition, so a lot of them became involved with the U.S. military, and by the post-Civil War era, they were able to get homestead land as veterans, and some of them did around their traditional area in Black River Falls, and a lot of them started to come back. In the 1920s, around the resort area of the Wisconsin Dells, of course that's an important area for the Ho-Chunk people, and the local Lions Club worked with the Ho-Chunk to begin to have what they called the Stand Rock ceremonial, which is still going on there, although now it's controlled by Ho-Chunk people doing traditional dances. And they did a program, and it became a place for Native peoples to actually camp out during the summer, and a lot of ways to maintain their language and culture and so forth. But it also attracted Native people from other places to give kind of variety to the performance, which brought some new kinds of trends. In the 1920s, coming out of the Southwest were 49 songs, which used vocables, used nowadays, of course, most prominently in powwow songs, but they also used English lyrics. And so we're going to hear one of these examples. This was a recording of a 49 song made in the Wisconsin Dells in 1946. Okay. Germans settled in Wisconsin in the late 1830s, and Wisconsin is the most German state in the Union. More than half the population has some German background, and of course we're known for beer and bratwurst and pretzels and that sort of thing. As many of you may know, just like Pennsylvania Dutch are Germans, the term Dutchman, Dutch from Deutsch, has been used often for people of German background rather than people from the Netherlands or Holland, who sometimes get called Hollanders or Holland Dutch. And there are a lot of interesting dialect songs that have come out of that used mixed language. And this is one example. It's from a singer named Noble Brown, and I'll tell you about him in a minute, but I do want to say that one of the most important strains of polka music in the upper Midwest is the so-called Dutchman style that is associated with a couple of seminal bands. One, Hans Wilfart from New Ulm, Minnesota, who became known as Whoopie John for his distinctive yodeling. He started playing at weddings, but then made sound recordings in the 1920s and also recorded over radio playing out of Minneapolis, and then toured incessantly. And then a guy named Harold Leffelmacher, also from New Ulm, Minnesota, started out with his band. They called them the Continentals, and but they weren't doing so well. But then they changed the name to the Six Fat Dutchmen, and none of them were especially fat, and they had about 9 in the band. But this was a really good title. And so this has been a very strong, still going part of the polka scene in the upper Midwest. But this fellow Noble Brown, his mother was actually a Hollander, Holland Dutch. His father was English. He grew up in Grant County, Wisconsin, but there were a lot of Germans who had come there in the 1840s. And as a young guy, a young boy, he left home, went up and worked in the woods in northern Wisconsin, and it was not unusual for lumber camps to have a lot of people who had sailed either on the salt seas or on the Great Lakes. And of course, lumber camp work was winter work, and one of the things you could do then, when you couldn't work in the woods in the winter was to work on a Great Lakes vessel, or else to go out and harvest in the Dakotas later in the season. So Brown did that. He got a taste for that. He ended up being a salt sea sailor. We don't know for sure where he picked up this. My father was a Dutchman, but if any of you are into shanties, the great scholar of songs of sailors, Stan Hugel, includes some really great notes on My Father Was a Dutchman, on one of these kind of mixed language songs that used to be on big sailing ships. And I have friends in Australia who are very familiar with this, mostly as an instrumental dance tune, but it's called My Father Was a Dutchman. It's the same tune that Noble Brown uses, and so we'll listen to that.
My father was a Dutchman, Dutch spreken versteest du. Mijn father was a Dutchman, versteest du, ja, ja.
Yeah. Okay. And part of my point here is that when we think about what constitutes American, there are many splendors to that definition. There's always a lot of stuff that's going on culturally, and when we think about folk music, it's not static. People are changing. They're taking on new influences. They're adapting. They're listening to other people, and so you have all kinds of interesting things happening. Very close to where I grew up, 15 miles away, is a little community called Cumberland, and I grew up in Rice Lake with people of a lot of different ethnic backgrounds. There were Ojibwas, there were Métis or Ojibwa French. My family was Irish. There were a lot of people who were Czech or Bohemian. There were Polish people there. There were Italians. There were lots of Norwegians, lots of Germans. There were Finns. There were a few Danes and Swedes, French Canadians, and old enough, born in 1950, that I was aware of a lot of that growing up. I could hear people speaking English in languages that wasn't their first language. And there was live radio in my hometown when I was growing up. I could hear Swiss music. I could hear Bohemian music periodically. There was the Skipper Berg band played Scandinavian old-time music. There was the Polish barn dance out of Weyerhaeuser, and so I could still hear a lot of that growing up. But these Italian folks were originally in St. Paul. They were working Minneapolis, St. Paul, and in the late 19th century, there was a strike against a railroad working in northern Wisconsin. The Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, or the CMSTP and P. A guy I knew who once worked for him told me, he said, "You know what those letters stand for? The cheapest, the meanest, the slowest to pay, and the last P stands for." And, but they hired these Italians as scabs to replace the other people who were on strike, and of course they were desperate new immigrants, and they came over and worked. But many of them bought land. They wanted to farm, and a lot of them started small businesses. And so if you go to Cumberland nowadays, there's a very strong Italian presence. There's great food there, and just really some wonderful people. One of them was a guy named Tom St. Angelo, and he ended up becoming the representative for my home district in the state assembly, which is kind of cool. My grandfather had that seat in the 30s, but Tom St. Angelo did in the 60s, and Cumberland has named their public library after him. He was a fine singer, and he got together with a number of his neighbors, Michael Rinaldo and Mr. and Mrs. Ambrose DeGidio, and they sang a really great song. It exists in a lot of different variations. The first verse is someone who's over in America. He's thinking America is beautiful, Italy is small. My little blonde is kind of an idiomatic term for my sweetheart. So he's not coming back, and then the daughter says to her mother, "Make my dowry ready. I want to go to America." The train and then the boat, and then in the last one they're both over here and they're not coming back. And this is done in a very nice choral arrangement. They actually sang only the first two verses, but he sent in the rest to Stratman Thomas. One of the challenges, I won't really get into it, but in 1947, Helene Stratman Thomas wanted to publish 200 songs from her field recordings for Wisconsin's 1948 centennial, and she wrote to the people who she'd recorded saying, "Can you send me the original lyrics in an English translation?" Well, the problem was these recordings were made on big disc cutting machines, and so it wasn't, you couldn't just dub off a cassette or a CD or send a sound file or something like that, and so people didn't necessarily know what they had sung, and so you got all sorts of things back, or sometimes no response at all if people weren't fluent in writing in English, let alone in their own language. But at any rate, that's another story. This fellow, Albert Wakuda, born in this country to Czech immigrants. Czechs began to settle in southwestern Wisconsin in the 1850s. There was a railroad built along the Wisconsin River so they could come through the Great Lakes and kind of go off into that area after they were at the port of Milwaukee and find nice farmland, which they did. Albert Wakuda farmed. He raised rabbits for their pelts and meat. He also, Prairie du Chien is where the Wisconsin River empties into the Mississippi, and he operated a little resort there. But he was a fine button accordion player, and his mother sang a lot of songs. She was from Becenie, a small village in what's now the Czech Republic, not too far from Prague. And one of the songs that she sang was about a soldier from Becenie, the village, who had gone off to fight in one of the many wars. And about the time of World War I, Albert adapted this. You can see on the left, Prerdyszyńskim zaradam. So to Prairie du Chien. He plays this on the button accordion for a while, plays the tune, and then he stops and sings without the accordion. So we'll listen to this first verse.
Já se podívám k predčínským zahradám. A ještě já se podívám k predčínským zahradám. Spatřím-li tam ještě modrooké děvče, já si na něj zavolám. Ani když ho tu nevidím, ani o něm neslyším.
So I'm gonna pause it there. It goes on for quite a few verses. He's off to the war, and he has various battles, and blood is flowing, and horses are falling, and men around him, and he's swinging his sword and stuff like that. But eventually, he does return. So, all right. Here we move to a little settlement, Belgium, Wisconsin, where somewhat paradoxically, people from the Duchy of Luxembourg settled in the 1850s. Wisconsin has, I think it's the, well, it may compete with Iowa in being the largest per capita Luxembourg, settlement in the United States. But there are some little communities, Fredonia and Port Washington and Belgium, where Luxembourgers settled. A lot of them were farmers. This fellow, Nicholas Becker, who we see the bottom center on the portrait, and also on this stamp from Luxembourg, was an immigrant. He was a farmer, but he also was a creative fellow. He wrote a long treatise on the history of Luxembourgers in Wisconsin, including something about all of the different nicknames that they had, because they had very few surnames. I remember one of them was, Watry, W-A-T-R-Y, was one of the surnames, and one of the nicknames he wrote about was someone who was called Cripple Watry. And that always stuck with me, because I went to the state wrestling tournament in Wisconsin in 1968, and I was defeated in the first round by a guy from Port Washington named Watry, who definitely wasn't crippled. but at any rate, one of the things this Nicholas Becker also did was to write poems and songs about the experience. One was about a hired man who was very confused because he couldn't get the oxen to obey him. They'd been brought up by English-speaking trainers, and so they responded to commands in English. And so this fellow was amazed that even in America, even the animals speak English. But this one is a song of greeting for a gathering of Luxembourgers. In this case, people from Chicago had come up, and this small countries like Luxembourg get really excited that some of their traditions have been sustained in America and venerated, and this is one of a number of examples of stamps issued, of people from Wisconsin who were documented by Helene Stratman Thomas in the Library of Congress in the 1940s. Actually, this is the singing of Nicholas's son, Jacob, who's right above him in the photograph. And I'll just play the first verse here.
Du den blåa Michigan, sing alle gent ons slån. Chicago, Port Washington, Milwaukee sich verdrohen. Da Senerlei a welche Stadt, a kleiner Hirt am Schloss. All lieber als in den Platz, wo gemütlich aus.
Okay, for these last couple, I'm going to shift to Alan Lomax's fieldwork in 1938, and Nikki mentioned my book, Polkabilly. I was very lucky a number of years ago to meet, since I've done a lot of work with Finnish Americans, to meet a filmmaker, Erkki Matanen, who's been making wonderful films for Finnish public television on Finnish Americans, and we had invited him over to University of Wisconsin, and he said, "Can I bring along my friend Jukka Karjalainen, and he's a musician?" And I said, "Sure." And I had no idea that this guy is a big star in Finland. He's sometimes known as the Finnish Bruce Springsteen. He's had many #1 records and so forth. And he came over. He'd made up this song cycle, actually, of Finnish American songs. He sort of invented this character. He said when he was 16, really bored at the summer cabin and into like learning to play American blues and rock and roll, his mother had driven him out of the house because he was so sulky, and he stumbled on this ancient neighbor who had been in America in the 20s and had hoboed around and learned to play banjo from Doc Boggs and guitar from Charlie Patton, and that he had this cycle of songs he'd made up about life in America, and so that's what this E. Karjalainen was presenting. Well, really, he'd been listening to the Harry Smith collection, reissuing a whole bunch of 78 RPM recordings from the 20s, and But E. Karjalainen wanted to know what Finnish Americans really sounded like. And so when he was over here, I had a set that I'd had a student digitize of Library of Congress recordings made by Alan Lomax of Finnish Americans in the Upper Peninsula. And so I gave him a copy of that. And his next 2 CDs, he included songs from that. Both of those CDs went to #1 on the Finnish charts, which is kind of cool. So I'm going to play a little bit of the original from a fellow named Emil Mäki from Newberry, Michigan. And this is a song in Finnish, but it's to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And that's not an uncommon thing among Finns, and there were a lot of Finns who were also members of the industrial workers of the world, and just like Joe Hill, the Swedish immigrant, used common popular songs and hymns sometimes, so did Finnish Wobblies. They use the tune of It's a Long Way to Tipperary and other kinds of things. And Emil Mackey is taking a stance distinctively against the rather pietistic Finnish Lutheran Church, because here in heaven people are dancing and being rowdy and stuff like that, and playing profane instruments like the accordion. So we'll listen to a little bit of Emil Mackey.
Mooses Pilatus ja Goljatti, Viljani, Aasia, profeetat muut, siellä hohotteli naurussa suut. Pitkät varrat siellä keikkuivat ja kaljutkin kiispeli värkkein, humina mun korviani viis. Hyvä Pietariani teli innostu kans, löin tahtia avainknipulan. Sun glory, glory, hallelujah.
Okay, we'll hear a little bit of how Ikarjalainen does it, and if you want to hear more, it's pretty easy to find him on YouTube. There's a whole lot of stuff up there. Okay. We're going to switch over now to a film that helps also to illustrate what I've been trying to stress about the continuing creative and kind of fusion nature of a lot of this music in the region. And in 1938, Alan Lomax took in addition to taking a huge disc-cutting recording machine, and a big bulky mic and a whole bunch of blank discs and so forth, he also took a silent film camera and a bunch of film. And unfortunately, some of it was stolen, but some of it existed. I found out about it years ago. Bill Ferris had done a kind of a little inventory of folklore films in the 1970s, and I went over, I think in this building actually, and watched a version of it, but it was in black and white, and a few years later I was able to get a video dub of it, but many years after that, Guha Shankar here discovered that it was, in fact, it was color film, and restored it to high digital format or whatever. But of course it was silent film, and Lomax did not do an especially good job of keeping track of who was in the film, and so we had to figure out who was in the film, and then we had to try to find if there were recordings of those people, and if there were recordings, could we in fact match them up with some of the footage. And we've actually completed a film, and I should say that what I'm talking about here will result in about a year from the fall in a book, a 5 CD set, and a DVD, a film that's tucked in called Folksongs of Another America that University of Wisconsin Press is going to publish, especially if I can finish the manuscript for it. But the film is finished pretty much thanks to Guha's effort. We've shown it a little bit in its entirety, and we'll be kind of putting out more. This is just a short clip from some Croatians with also an Italian surname, because the patriarch of the family lived sojourned in Italy, and there's some intermarriage, so they're Italian Croatians from that part of the Adriatic Sea. They were miners in the copper, in the copper country of Michigan, in the Amik and Lake Linden area, and they were tamburitsa musicians. But they also they liked what's now called what the hell is it called? Some call it gypsy swing, thinking of Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli and that kind of stuff. And so they did a little song called 21st Century Blues that's a complaint about the terrible conditions in the mines and how they wanted to beat up the boss. And then from that, then they swing into a traditional Croatian tamburitsa song, Miko Moja. And so we'll see this little film clip from this larger film.
31st level blues, from my head down to my shoes. In the morning I wolf around, in the evening my stars I frown. When the boss comes down and says, get up, don't stall around. Show some pep, try to keep your rest. Work makes my back ache, and someday his head I'll break. Cause I got those blues, those 31st level blues.
Music played by Vladimir Goryani and his two sons, Vladimir Jr. and Zeko.
Okay, that's it. So what I've tried to do is just give you a very small glimpse of some of these field recordings, along with some film footage from 1937 to 1946. As I said, this is material that was gathered during a very critical historical period, and has come here to the Library of Congress. A lot of it has been hidden for many years because of the challenges of the many languages, plus the technical challenges of restoring it that I really haven't gone into, as well as some of the ideological challenges that have defined what constitutes being American in a very narrow way. And so what I tried to do here with this selection, and I think it comes through in the larger body of work, is to show that these people are in fact Americans. They're working here, they're singing about the place, they're mixing the language, there's all kinds of interesting ferment, and I think by looking at this kind of area, which is similar in many ways to urban centers, industrialized backwoods areas are very similar to so-called border towns, whether we look at New Orleans or New York City or Los Angeles or whatever. There's all this ferment that's going on, and went on then. It's going on right now, and I think documenting it has an awful lot to tell us about the American experience, and of course it also highlights the tremendous value of the collections at the American Folklife Center. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a lot of fun to show this to you. Or comments or whatever? Yeah. Complaints? Yes.
Hi, how much of this is available online? Are there any collections and songs available online?
No, I think. Well, actually, yes. Some of it is. I'm sorry. Yes, the Wisconsin material of Helene Stratman Thomas is available. If you Googled Wisconsin Folksong collection, what happened was the Wisconsin materials back in the 60s or early 70s, the music library there acquired preservation master tapes from the Library of Congress, and then those were digitized subsequently in the 1990s, late 90s or early in the 2000s, and then they've been put up. They stream there, and also some of the Sidney Robertson collections, the ones from Wisconsin, not the Minnesota ones. They're online as well, and so you can search by instrument or place or genre or ethnic group for those. The Lomax ones, the non-English language ones, and a lot of the other material, no, but that's being worked on, right?
Yeah, in association with what's going on to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Lomax in Michigan, we're working to get those materials, the rights cleared on those materials so that they can go online through the library's website. It's in progress.
Yeah, and there's a card index for some of this stuff that's online, but it's also challenging because, as we've discovered, there are lots of errors because of the language differences and so forth. So, but it little by little, yeah. Other? Yes.
You mentioned that Helene Stratman Thomas had people send in translations.
Oh, yeah.
But about the language things, are you working on that now?
Yeah, actually, with the project that I'm working on, selects 175 songs and tunes out of the 2,000, and I try to be somewhat representative. And so over the years, I've worked with people who have expertise in all the languages. So the project I'm working on will have the book part. It'll have photographs. It'll have like you saw here a sample from that, where you've got the original language and then an English translation, and then we'll have annotations or comparative information about the songs and tunes and that sort of thing. But it's been really hard, and sometimes it's taken whole teams of people, and sometimes still we can't figure out, because not only are the recordings 70 some 80 years old, but people are sometimes singing rapidly, or maybe they've had a few drinks, or maybe they're the children of immigrants and they don't quite know what they're singing, or maybe they come. We had one song that was actually, it was a song about a Viennese military regiment, the Deutschmeisters, and there were esoteric references to a certain kind of hairstyle we figured out was called a fiesco, and it was after a character named Count Fiesco, who was in a Schiller's stage drama or something like that. And it just took a hell of a long time to figure out that that's what was being sung, was some kind of pomade you needed to get this fiesco haircut just right. So there have been lots of little trips down the rabbit hole about all of this stuff. Yeah. Yes, back there, and then up here. Yeah. Yes.
During these trips in the 30s and 40s, was there documentation about how these were performed? I noticed in one of the photographs it said Dodgeville concert, and I'm particularly interested if these were performed in theaters either at that time or later.
Well, most of the recordings were made in people's homes, but sometimes they were made in halls in different places. Sometimes some of the recorders were run on battery, but sometimes if there was a power source, they went to where that would be, and there weren't power sources everywhere. Alan Lomax in particular did not want to record people who were professionals or were trained. But early on, Helene Stratman Thomas didn't exactly know what kind of distinctions she ought to make from the point of view of the Library of Congress at that time. And so she recorded, for example, a Finnish guy named Hjalmar Nukala from Superior, and the Finns had workers' halls, and they also had choral groups, and Hjalmar and his wife sang in the workers' chorus of Duluth and Superior. But he also performed on stage to the piano accompaniment of his wife, and he's doing a song called Tula Tula La Pasket Pula La, which is about a little baby with their cheeks stuffed with like a special sweet bread, and it's a lullaby for kids, but he sings it in this really booming way, rolling his R's and trilling and so forth, and so it's definitely a concert kind of performance. And then a number of if you listen to the 21st century blues, clearly they've been listening to kind of ragtime bluesy sorts of things. These people were listening to sound recordings. Performers were coming over from the old country. People in the lumber camps were singing Irish songs that were Harrigan and Hart, kind of My Dad's Dinner Pail, and stuff like that. And so what the whole corpus gives you really is a sense of all these different influences that are floating around, including the one that you asked about. So it's definitely part of it all. Yes?
I noticed that there's relatively little in your presentation that involved English language songs, although you certainly dealt with it. But I'm wondering if, which was the only music from the area that I was previously familiar with, the English language songs of the lumberjacks and the old English ballads that were in the area. I wonder if your book will similarly have a relatively low percentage.
No, actually, there's a fair amount that's in there. What I didn't want to do, like there's the Library of Congress LP that hasn't been reissued fully, Songs of the Michigan Lumberjacks, and then there's a folklorist Laurie Summers who's done stuff with songs from Beaver Island, and some of those have been issued through Michigan State University Press. And then there was a Folksongs of Wisconsin LP, Helene Stratman Thomas, that had a few fiddle tunes from Otto Rindlisbacher, but then mostly English language songs. And so I haven't replicated any of that except for one song by Emery DeNoyer, where the full song was on 2 discs, and on the LP that was reissued by Rounder as a CD, they don't have the part from the second disc that was recorded, so I've put the 2 of them together. But there's a lot of English language songs. Aunt Lily Richmond, who I showed a picture of, there are 3 songs from her, the African American woman in southwestern Wisconsin. I especially included some bawdy, some raunchy lumberjack songs that weren't issued on some of these previous recordings as well, because I think they need to be there along with all of the other material. So yeah, there are a lot of English language songs. Some from England. Some there were Kentuckians who came up from eastern Kentucky to work in the woods in northern Wisconsin. There's some songs from them. There's a lot of songs from a kind of an Irish tradition in the English language. So there's plenty of that too. Yeah. Yes, Linda.
Hi. I'm interested in the Italian song, and I have access to Library of Congress materials, and so how could I look it up and access it?
There's on the library's site. There's this what's it called? Traditional song. There's a
traditional music and spoken word catalog.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And so if you entered, you could search by group. You could put in Italian and find a whole lot of Italian stuff, which might be a good thing, because Alan Lomax recorded some very interesting Italian songs in the UP, including an anti-fascist song in the 30s. There's a lot of kind of current stuff. Or you could enter by the particular performer. The same.
I wouldn't know. I just know from your
Yeah, you could just enter Italian. You could enter Italian.
St. Paul.
You could enter Italian there.
We certainly have some folks in the audience to help you. You can search by location as well. You can search for a state or a city.
If you come to our reading room or talk to anyone in the Folklife Center,
We'll show you how to do it.
We'd be happy to help you again. Can we take one last question? Hearing none?
Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.